Well, listen, let's start with this. Your article obviously is about the need to expand these social safety net programs. This is sort of a perennial specter looming over the financial and physical, biological lives of American people. What prompted you to write it at this particular moment?
Yes. Well, the Republicans have really been on the warpath lately. The Republican Study Committee, which is about 80% of House Republicans, actually came up with a proposal recently to raise the retirement age for Social Security. They are being quite bold about it. Senator Mike Lee from Utah, not so long ago, came out and said that he wanted to get rid of Social Security altogether. I believe his exact words were he wanted to pull it up by the roots and get rid of it. Now you have Donald Trump changing his tune on Social Security and Medicare. He is definitely open to making changes. He's made that clear. Changes, of course, meaning cuts.
Right.
It's code word for cuts, which is a very different tune than he was singing some months ago when he was running in the primary and distinguishing himself from other candidates by saying that he wouldn't touch those programs. Now he's saying he will. And frankly, we don't really know what Biden will do. Biden says that he wants to strengthen and expand these programs, but he's got a rather patchy history on this. And if he's elected again, I don't think anyone can be absolutely sure. And I also read a book recently by the wonderful economist Teresa Gilarducci, who wrote a lot, it did a lot of research and wrote a lot of interesting things about how working into old age actually affects us mentally and physically. There was a lot that I didn't even know, and I've been researching this subject for a while. So that got me thinking. And the headline, it sounds extreme, work longer, die sooner. But according to the research I'm seeing, for most Americans, that's a reality.
Right, I think that's exactly right. Let's talk about you covered a couple of the sort of the slices of the population that wage war, in my view, on Social Security. I mean, it's kind of like the rings of hell, I guess, these Dantean rings of hell. But you have uh, Republicans who have been extreme in their hostility toward both Social Security and Medicare, going back to the debates that led to the creation of Social Security in 1935, is extremely against it. Lurid language. I wrote a piece about it for the American Prospect. Even oh, a man shall be enslaved and the temples of, I mean, just
Right.
horrendous. So you have that insanity. You have the what might be called centrist assault, even though it's not centrist in terms of the views of uh, the electorate, but
Exactly.
centrist in the views of insiders in Washington, which is seeded richly seeded by billionaire money like billionaire Peter G. Peterson and so on. But it's saying, well, we can't afford it any longer. It can't go on this way. So we're going to have to cut. And that's the so-called experts who misrepresent. You write about a couple of them. We'll get to them. And for many years, Joe Biden was deeply in that category as a politician, very much part of that. Oh, we need to do the responsible thing and sacrifice old people. He ran in 2016. 2016 was an interesting year because not only, as you mentioned, did Trump distinguish himself from the other primary candidates by saying he wouldn't cut Social Security. Joe Biden promised to expand Social Security, which many Democrats, Senate Democrats, had already signed on to a resolution to do. He has not mentioned that since, but he had, to my knowledge, but he has said that he doesn't want to cut it. Uh, and that's, I guess, better than nothing. So now that brings us up to the present. And obviously, an election year, not only presidential, but as is always the case, congressional in the House, some senators. How is this tracking, you think, in terms of, let's say, the Republican side of the ledger? How are they running on this issue?
Well, I mean, all of the primary candidates were Republican candidates were talking about cutting Social Security and Medicare in one way or another. And of course, now Donald Trump is, and the House Republicans seem quite emboldened on the issue. And it's really surprising to me in a way. Well, they've always been wanting to do this, but in such a close election that they would be making all these noises because, again, as you pointed out, the vast majority of people in America support Social Security robustly. And in fact, the majority of them want to see Social Security and Medicare expanded. It's one of those rare things that people largely agree upon across the political aisle. So I don't know how they think that it's going to impact the electorate. I guess they're just relying on their wealthy donors because it's really the very wealthy people in the United States that don't want to pay their fair share of taxes who have such an interest in decimating these programs. I mean, that's all it is. So they're signaling to their wealthy donors. That's what's going on.
And what's amazing to me is I guess because whether gerrymandering or for whatever reason, at least at the congressional level, they're not afraid of answering to the voters for these views. I mean, I also wrote an article about a video that the House Appropriations Committee Republican members made a Zoom video that they posted online. Only had 600 views when it was brought to my attention, where they said things like, if we told the truth about what we want to do with Social Security, we'd never get elected again. And one of them said, this is the conversation we can never have about what they really want to do. But some of them are being pretty blatant about it, which gets me to
Yes.
another demographic here. And I'd love your thought about this before we get to the so-called, well, maybe we should do the experts first as I think about it. Uh, these people are being fed by a vast sort of terrarium of think tanks, so-called lobbying groups that pretend to think, I would say, who produce lies, damn lies, and pie charts, and they're always telling the public and politicians that we can't afford to continue Social Security and Medicare. They always take the stance, and culturally, I think this is fascinating. And you're a cultural historian. They always take the stance, and the media goes along with it. We're being the adults in the room, right? We're having the adult conversation. We're taking the emotion out of it and just talking about facts and figures of what can be done. But they're very careful not to mention the certain options like taxing billionaires or Wall Street. And when you don't even have to scratch the surface before you see enormously overheated emotionality in their rhetoric. So,
Yeah.
what do you make of that? Is that just a deeply cynical? You write, for example, about Eugene Stourley, and I forget who else wrote a New York.
Lynn Kramen, who is a lecturer or was a lecturer at the time for Stanford Business School when he co-authored an op-ed with Mr. Sturl, really enumerating several false arguments about why we should raise the retirement age. They sort of crystallize all the false cases against Social Security and Medicare. One of the things they said, for example, they painted a picture of retired Americans as just having a grand old time playing pickleball and jet setting around. And, that may be true of the people that they know and that they hang out with. I mean, I think part of it is cynicism, and then part of it is just a complete disconnect men like this have from ordinary working Americans. So they claim that Americans are getting healthier and they're living longer every year. And again, that's only true for a small slice of the population. A Harvard study showed that the wealthiest Americans live 10 years longer than their poorest counterparts. Well, that's great for them, but not so much for the rest of us. Two very well-regarded economists at Princeton, whose work I'm sure you and your listeners are familiar with, Ann Case and Angus Deaton, they came out with a study recently that showed that people without college degrees were now estimated to live 8.5 years less than people with a college degree. I mean, that is a huge gap and it's getting worse. America is now an outlier among comparable countries in terms of our longevity and our mortality. You know, we're falling behind, and it is really an extreme stretch of the truth to suggest that we're all getting healthier and living longer lives. That's just simply not the case.
Well, I couldn't agree more. And for at least 3 years, maybe there's been new data, but for at least 3 years, even before COVID, our longevity rates in this country have been falling, not
Yes.
rising. So there's not a time to uh, be smug about people living longer. One aspect of this is shared by these so-called experts. First of all, I remember when that op-ed you wrote about came out, a lot of economists, friends of mine who work in this field or related fields, were shocked that, I mean, they didn't know Kramen particularly, but they were shocked that Eugene Steuerl, who they had considered a kind of uh, honorably wrong. They disagreed with him, but they thought he was, ethical and straight shooting and all
Yeah.
that. Just disagreed on the facts and the interpretation. But I remember several of them were shocked at the intensity, the vehemence of this
Yeah.
piece, as well
Yeah,
as its
they use language like old people are robbing the young. I mean, that's
right.
the picture that they were painting, despite the fact that what they are suggesting would actually literally be robbing from the young people in America, stealing their retirement years and when most of them can't even vote yet. I mean, this as a Gen X representative, this has already happened to me. Before I was 18 years old and old enough to vote under Reagan, the retirement age for Social Security was raised 2 years from 65 to 67. So 2 years of my retirement were taken away, and I didn't have any say in the matter. So that's what it means to rob from the young. But it's really shocking to hear educated men like this suggesting that people collecting Social Security now are robbing from the young when they've been paying into this program their entire working life. I mean, it's a self-funded program. I believe that they know that that's simply not true. That's a very, very specious argument.
Well, it's a hateful argument
It's a
too.
hateful
And,
argument.
by the way, I am not a Gen Xer, but I had those 2 years taken from my retirement as well. So, they were phased in over a period of time after the 1983, the Greenspan Commission and all that stuff, I guess. But so you have this, and I'm fascinated because somebody must think this plays well. You had the Obama Deficit Commission,
Oh, yes. Erskine Bowles.
Erskine
Brad.
Bowles, rich Democrat, Alan Simpson, rich Republican, Simpson calling, while Obama was lecturing the left about being civil in their disagreements, Simpson was going around calling old people greedy geezers, one of his words, saying Social Security was a milk cow with 310 million teeth.
Very memorable line. Yes.
Spewing hatred. And I think the Storal Kramen piece does the same, but it's extremely common. Ross Douthat I don't know how it's pronounced, Douthat at the New York Times has written a couple pieces just dripping with loathing and visceral disgust toward the aging and the aging.
Yeah.
And this sense of generational warfare, I tried to get some sense out of this young guy who wrote a book not very good called A Generation of Sociopaths or something, suggesting that the old had stolen from the young. It's all, among other things, I'm fascinated by two parts of it. One is that this generational warfare mythology is a great distraction from class warfare, in my
Sure.
view. And the other, though, is just the hatred, um, including from liberal Democrats who say, the old are just ripping off the young. Your generation, meaning mine, they need to die. So, oh, well, which one's ripping off? the young. Was it, Robert Byrd, the black man who was murdered by a
Yeah.
pickup truck in Texas? Was it, Cornell West? I mean, let's name some names.
Yeah.
And because they just want to lump people, in a way, it's
And
a
they pretend to care about older people. At this out of one side of their mouth, they're saying these hateful things, and the other side of their mouth, they're pretending to care. They're saying, "Oh, we want people to work longer because it's good for them, because it'll keep them sharp, it'll keep them healthy longer, it'll keep them socially engaged." Well, we have research, very robust research now that shows that that is simply not the case for most Americans. Florida state researchers, for example, have done work showing that if you work in jobs where there's certain kinds of stresses, like loud noises, like mold, like lead, various kinds of chemicals, that causes cognitive decline. So you're not getting mentally sharper in those
took.
jobs. You're experiencing cognitive decline. In terms of the physical effect of working into old age, I think most people, it's common sense to understand that if you have a physically demanding job, if you're a construction worker, for example, or a miner or something like that, that working into old age is going to cause more accidents, illness, and it's going to shorten your life. That's pretty clear. But what if you have a desk job? What if your job isn't physically demanding? Well, there's a lot of research that shows that jobs that are stressful and unrewarding, even, jobs where you just don't feel like you're appreciated, you don't have a lot of autonomy, you don't have a lot of control over the content and the pace of work. These jobs are really unhealthy, and working in them longer produces all kinds of negative physical effects. We're talking about hypertension, we're talking about heart attacks, we're talking about all kinds of mental health issues. And guess what? The majority of Americans unfortunately don't have stimulating, dignified jobs where they have a lot of autonomy and control. That may be true for lawmakers, that may be true for professors, tenured professors at some of our top universities, but the majority of us don't have that luxury. And so working longer can actually hasten our death. I spoke to Teresa Gilarducci, the economist I referenced, about this, and she talked particularly about women working in low-paying jobs where they don't have much agency. And she just said flat out, working longer can hasten their death. It's
Mm.
lethal. And that's, of course, even more true for women of color. So this argument that working longer is going to be great for us is just total BS. The other thing, social engagement. If you go to work, aren't you going to be socializing with people? Actually, no. If your job is stressful and it's unrewarding, you may not have the motivation or the energy to socialize with anybody. And so you'll end up even more lonely than you would have been if you had been able to take retirement. So that's one false argument. And the other false argument people like Stuerl and Kramen make is it's this assumption that people get to pick the time that they retire. And Gilarducci points out this is really based, a lot of academics base their theories about what retirement looks like on a sort of hypothetical person who has a very good job, decent pay, autonomy, stimulating job, and just tacks a few extra years onto that. Well, okay, that may be good for your health. That's not, again, the reality for most people. For most people, they don't get to choose when they retire. They get pushed out by somebody above them who says, it's time to go. That may be because their productivity is not as high as the younger people. It may just be because of bias against older people. And, when we talk about bias against older workers, workers are experiencing age discrimination as early as age 35. That's particularly true in industries like the tech industry and the entertainment industry. And so the idea that you could keep working, or that you could keep working with the same salary that you had when you were younger, and save up a whole pile of money for your retirement, that simply does not hold up in reality. We have the studies and statistics to prove that.
And one of the things you also mentioned, Lynn, is in terms of delaying retirement, that you mentioned that keeping your mind sharp in a stimulating job might delay cognitive decline. but Florida State, they're actually saying that it accelerates.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. It hits home for me. My mother had been an elementary school teacher and went on to be a professor at NC State University in the education department. And they are making headlines right now because Poe Hall, the building that the professors and staff and students were working in, was contaminated. And people working in it were at PCBs and they were poisoned. And there have been, off the charts cases of cancer and all kinds of other issues. And it's really hard to prove the causal link, but I do wonder if mental decline, cognitive issues may be part of it. My mother has dementia now. Nobody else in her family has ever had it. So working longer under conditions, in which you're exposed to things like that is not good for your brain. Even as the Florida State researchers pointed out, even where you're exposed to loud noises, and I live in New York City, that's a lot of jobs. I mean,
Right.
basically any job where you're working outside in the city. This causes cognitive decline. It makes your brain age faster.
Yes, and I think that makes a tremendous amount of sense. Also, the factor of pain can't be ignored. If you don't have the good fortune to be a professor at the Stanford Business School, but instead you're a woman in her late 60s waiting tables, let's say, or a man in his early 70s stacking boxes in a warehouse, a job I had, but I was young and it was hard even then. The physical pain that you're going to endure uh, is not good for you either. Chronic pain
Well,
is also a trigger for all sort, besides being bad in and of itself, something we should not force people to endure. It's also deleterious to your health in many different ways as well, isn't it?
that's absolutely the case. And let's not forget, we've got more and more information about how dangerous it is to sit all day, to just sit at a desk. One of the reasons that the United States does not compare favorably to other wealthy countries in terms of mortality and longevity is that we have higher rates of chronic diseases associated with obesity, like diabetes. And these conditions are most definitely exacerbated by not being able to exercise and having sedentary jobs. We know this. So even again, if you have a desk job, all kinds of pain, lower back pain, all kinds of issues can arise with that sedentary job. And Gilarducci, when I was talking to her about this, said, when people get to retire, they have more leisure time and they may have more motivation and energy to exercise than they ever did when they were working, God knows how many hours a day at a job that they didn't feel was even rewarding or mattered. The David Graeber, the wonderful anthropologist that we lost during the pandemic, probably to COVID, famously referred to the jobs that a lot of Americans hold as
Don't
bull.
say it. It's a word we can't use. Bull
Okay,
blank
BS
jobs.
jobs. Let's
Yeah,
say BS
BS
jobs.
jobs. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
David
So
was
there,
on the show talking about that book, and it was very difficult to talk.
okay, so BS jobs, essentially jobs that you yourself as a person doing the job don't feel that they're meaningful or they benefit anybody. And when you have a job like that, it's associated with all kinds of health issues. He wrote about this in his book. So all of this argument about how working into our 70s and 80s and however long Cyril and Graymon want us to work is going to be great for us. There's just so many reasons that stack up that that's just nonsense.
And you also quote in your piece, "Work harder, die sooner." Uh, uh, President Biden, in his recent State of the Union speech, he said, "Quote: If anyone here tries to cut Social Security or Medicare or raise the retirement age, I will stop them." End quote. And I caught that too. Maybe for a slightly different reason, though. You mentioned that he supported raising the retirement age during the 1980s and again in 2005. In fact, he's been pretty consistently close to that wing of the Democratic Party, dominant wing for a long time, if not still, that wants to be the adult in the room by punishing the adults in the room. But what I noticed about that quote stuck out for me for what it didn't say, which
Hmm.
is during the campaign, he said he wanted to expand Social Security. Now he's saying, no one, I won't let anybody cut them. Now that's better than saying, as Obama did, I will work with Republicans to cut them, in effect. But it's a retreat.
It
And
is.
yeah, and I would think with so much at stake, with Trump now, according to the latest polls, leading in the five battleground states in terms of concerns about control of Congress and so on, you would think you link to some of the polling data. It's overwhelmingly supportive of these programs. People, majorities, including majorities of Republicans, want to see them expanded.
Yeah.
So I am, unless it's all about the donor class, I'm utterly baffled why the Democrats aren't leaning into this every day. They're getting hammered, and Biden, especially rightfully so, in my view, about Gaza. But why wouldn't they take an issue that they're supposed to be stronger on and that
Yeah.
they ran on last time and emphasize it as much as they can?
Yeah, it's as if they think that doing nothing is a good enough stance against someone like Donald Trump, who's open to cutting these programs. And it's not. The Social Security program is supposed to be adjusted every so often. I use the analogy of a car, which gets a regular tune-up to keep it running effectively. So Social Security was designed so that the cap on earnings would go up periodically. I think it
Right,
stands now at $168,000. That's ridiculously low. That means that a person making $168,000 a year pays the exact same in Social Security taxes than someone making $100 million.
right,
Now, raising the cap would be such a tiny, tiny sacrifice for those wealthy people in America, but they're absolutely obsessed with it. And I do think they keep the pressure on. And I can't think of any other reason than money in politics, which unfortunately drives so much of our system, as to why our political representatives would be so out of step with what ordinary people want. There was that famous study that Martin Gilens and his co-author
Page.
Benjamin Page did, showing how our political class habitually supports the ideas and the desires of the very wealthy over the electorate on so many issues. I mean, abortion is another one. Most people don't want abortion outlawed, and look at what's happening.
Right.
So, unfortunately, we have a plutocracy right now. So I think that's why the voters' desires are being ignored on this. But also, they play around. They
Hmm.
play around with the language, and oh, we're just going to raise the retirement age a year or two instead of cutting benefits. They don't like to say cut
Right.
benefits, but of course that is a cut. Or we're going to play around with the cost of living adjustment so that it doesn't rise as quickly. I mean, they have all kinds of little ways of not saying that they're going to cut the programs when that's actually what they mean. Every time they talk about fixing, Social Security is not broken. I
Right.
mean, one thing I like to point out to people, it's one of the few things that works really, really well. Even during the pandemic, even during a financial crisis, people got those checks reliably every month. They were inflation adjusted. Um, what else can you depend on like that? Certainly not a pension from a private company. Absolutely not. So it's not broken. It's saying that it's bankrupt that's a technical impossibility. And even if there is a shortfall caused by Republicans and these, even some Democrats getting along with blocking the raising the cap and so on, even by law, people would still get monthly checks. They would just
Right.
be at a reduced amount. So this idea that it's going bankrupt, it's just simply a lie. It's a lie that these people think if they repeat often enough, folks are going to believe it. And unfortunately, that happens to be true in many cases.
Yeah, but their definition of bankrupt is when the trust funds run out. Well, the Pentagon doesn't have a trust fund. Is the Pentagon bankrupt? That's their logic. And while we're on this, a couple other words they like to
Yeah.
play with: entitlements, which was originally a technical term, meaning you're entitled to it by law, but because it has that ring of, oh, you feel entitled, right? So they love to use that word pejoratively. Reform is another one. Reform, Medicare reform, Social Security reform. They've taken tax, they've taken their idea. If they were fixed cars like they reformed social programs, they just steal the hubcaps. I mean, it's unbelievable. But before we go, Lynn, there are two counter arguments that people will have to this, and it's worth just briefly touching on them.
Sure.
One is they say, oh, okay, if Lynn Parramore is right, and Angus Deaton and Susan Cates are right, and it's the rich who live longer, uh, why should we increase benefits? That's just going to help the rich. And the other, which is related to me, is, well, benefits are too generous. Why don't we? The billionaires don't need uh,
Mhm.
their social security check. Let's just means test.
Yeah.
Now, I know I have thoughts on this. What are your thoughts?
I remember I interviewed Nobel Prize winning economist Joseph Stiglitz on this subject, and I remember his line, means testing is just mean. It's a way to attack the program, to get people divided about it. Our public schools, anybody can go to those schools. The son and daughter of the
Right.
richest people in the country can go to those schools. And the reason we do it like that is because this is something as a society we deem is important to all of us collectively. And having a dignified retirement works the same way. We all collectively, and again, this is reflected in the electorate, want to see people have a dignified retirement. And so means testing is just a way for the rich people to be able to go out and say, oh, look, it's just those crummy poor people that are collecting Social Security. So let's just get rid of the whole program. I mean, it's been shown over and over that when you means test a program like this, it loses support and it shrinks and disintegrates. So that's what they're really up to with that. And in terms of, the rich living longer and collecting Social Security longer, that's really a minuscule portion of the whole program in totality. So that really doesn't have much of an economic impact. I mean, it's not like these gazillionaires are going to get tens of thousands of dollars a year in Social Security. That's not true. There is a limit on what they can get. It's probably like $3,000 or something, and it's a drop in the bucket when you look at
Yeah.
the program in
It's
its entirety.
yeah, it's more like for something, but yeah. And the other thing is the people who are so concerned about the injustice of billionaires collecting Social Security are also the ones opposing taxing Social Security. See, if you decide to means test, you have to build all these mechanisms for linking the IRS system and the Social Security system. Tax them. We have the mechanism already, progressive taxation. If
Yeah,
they pay their fair share, let them take their 48,000 or whatever
yeah,
it is because they've kicked in. And
yes.
that's the part that people lose. So as far as living longer, yeah, well, next time maybe we'll talk about Medicare and why more poor people don't live longer. Or maybe next time we'll talk about
Yeah, and
nutrition.
and
And
how if you force people to retire older and they haven't had access to Medicare, they're going to be a lot sicker when they do retire, and it's going to produce further strain on the system. So it makes no sense that way either.
yeah, absolutely. So Lynn Paramore, author and cultural historian, this is quite a cultural phenomenon we're seeing as well as a political one.
It
We're
is.
seeing big money at work in the political process. But to me, I think we're also seeing a culture of contempt for working Americans and older
Yes.
Americans.
Yes.
That's
Just pull yourself up and get out there and work,
right,
be
right.
lazy.
Stop playing all that pickleball.
Stop playing
Uh,
all that pickleball. Ugh.
We depend on your support here at the Zero Hour, so please give whatever you can at any of the links you see on your screen. Thanks so much.